Chief Warrant Officer 3. Hannah Brooks rested her Nomex-gloved hands loosely on her thighs, letting the deep, rhythmic vibration of the twin General Electric turboshaft engines rattle upward through the floorboards and into her boots. The cockpit of the UH-60 Blackhawk smelled the way it always did, a distinct, metallic blend of burned JP-8 aviation fuel, hot electronics, and old sweat. At 32 years old, Hannah had spent nearly a third of her life in this seat. She wasn't known among the aviation battalions for pulling off flashy, cinematic maneuvers, nor did she hold the record for the fastest insertion times. Her reputation was built on something far more valuable in military aviation. She was incredibly, aggressively reliable. She survived by respecting the math, honoring the aircraft's limits, and adhering strictly to protocol. In a combat zone, being predictable kept your crew alive. APU is off. Her co-pilot, a 25-year-old warrant officer named Miller, reported through the internal comms. Miller was relatively new to the theater, his movements still carrying the nervous, rigid energy of a recent flight school graduate. Temperatures are in the green. Pressures look good. Ready for taxi, Chief. Copy that, Miller, Hannah said, her voice a calm, flat baritone over the headset. Let's take it slow. Crosswinds are picking up. They were idling on the cracked tarmac of a remote forward operating base, preparing for what was supposed to be a standard logistics hop, moving mail and replacement parts to an outpost 50 miles north. Through the scratched acrylic of the windshield, Hannah watched a heavy ceiling of slate-gray clouds bruising the horizon. The weather was turning fast. The barometric pressure was dropping, and the thin mountain air was about to get a lot thinner and significantly more turbulent. In the back of the aircraft, her two crew chiefs, Jackson and Ruiz, were strapped in behind their M240H machine guns, running their final comm checks. They were the eyes in the back of her head, the guardians of the aircraft's blind spots. Hannah felt the familiar, heavy weight of command settle over her shoulders. 4 lives in the aircraft, counting her own. Her responsibility. She rested her right hand on the cyclic and gripped the collective with her left, preparing to call the tower for takeoff clearance. Then, the primary tactical radio hissed with a sharp, broken burst of static. Dust off 2-6. This is Havoc Base. Abort your current tasking. Acknowledge. Hannah's thumb immediately depressed the transmit switch on the cyclic. The shift in tone from the base operator was unmistakable. The bored, administrative drawl was gone, replaced by a clipped, tightly coiled urgency. Havoc Base, dust off 2-6, Hannah replied smoothly. Copy abort, standing by for traffic. 2-6, we have a TIC, troops in contact. A 6-man Pathfinder element is pinned down in the Korengal Wash, grid reference Yankee Sierra 49er. They are taking sustained, heavy, plunging fire from elevated positions. Multiple casualties reported. You are the only asset spun up and within fuel range. Weather is closing the window. We need you to push immediately. Hannah stared at the green glow of her multifunction displays. The Korengal Wash wasn't just a valley. It was a deep, jagged scar in the earth, characterized by sheer rock faces and unpredictable downdrafts. Flying into a ravine under fire was an aviation nightmare. Flying into it while a storm system rolled over the peaks violated 6 standard operating safety margins. She didn't hesitate. Havoc Base, 2-6 is inbound, passing ETA as soon as we're airborne. Good hunting, 2-6, Havoc out. Hannah switched her channel back to the internal crew network. Change of plans, boys. Mail call is canceled. We have a recon team taking heavy contact in the Wash. We are their ride home. Copy that, Chief. Jackson's voice came back instantly from the cabin, his tone shifting from relaxed to entirely focused. She heard the heavy, metallic clack of the M240s being locked and loaded. Miller, Hannah said, turning her head slightly to look at her co-pilot. His face had gone pale beneath his visor. Pull up the grid. Give me a direct heading. It's going to be rough air once we clear the foothills, so keep your eyes on the radar altimeter. I want to know exactly where the rocks are before we hit the cloud deck. Plotting now, Chief, Miller said, his fingers flying across the navigation keypad. Hannah slowly pulled up on the collective, adding power while feeding in left pedal to counteract the massive torque of the main rotor. The Black Hawk shuddered, breaking contact with the Earth, and transitioned smoothly into a low hover. "Skids are clear," Ruiz reported from the back. Hannah pushed the cyclic forward, pitching the nose down. The helicopter accelerated rapidly, eating up the runway before banking sharply toward the jagged silhouette of the mountain range to the east. As they climbed, the wind caught them. The airframe groaned under the sudden, violent turbulence, bouncing against the invisible currents rolling off the peaks. Rain began to speckle the windshield, smearing the dust into mud. Hannah fought the controls, her inputs precise and measured, constantly correcting the aircraft's attitude. In her headset, she tuned into the ground frequency. At first, it was just the hiss of the squelch braking. Then, she heard them. "Any air on this net? This is Viper 2. We have 2 urgent surgicals, 1 routine. We are trapped on the valley floor, taking PKM fire from the North Ridge." The voice was breathless, punctuated by the rhythmic, terrifying popping sound of incoming gunfire. "We cannot hold this position. We need dust off right now." Hannah kept her eyes fixed on the darkening horizon, her jaw tight. The ravine was approaching, a dark, narrow maw opening up in the mountainside ahead of them. The weather was dropping visibility to less than a mile, and the crosswinds were howling. To go down into that trench meant giving up their altitude, their speed, and their options. "Viper 2, this is Dustoff 2-6, Hannah said, keeping her voice completely level, knowing the men on the ground needed to hear an anchor in the storm. "We are 3 minutes out. Keep your heads down. We're coming into the basement." The descent into the Korengal Wash felt like dropping a stone down a jagged, narrow chimney. As the Black Hawk sank below the ridgeline, the ambient light in the cockpit instantly dimmed, blocked by towering walls of dark striated rock on either side. The storm above sealed off the sky, turning the ravine into a claustrophobic tunnel of wind and shadow. "Radar altimeter alive. 100 feet and descending," Miller called out, his voice tight but steady. His eyes were glued to the instruments, trusting Hannah to manage the outside world. "I have the ground," Hannah replied. The moment she spoke, the fuselage shuddered violently. It didn't sound like the cinematic crack of gunfire. It sounded like someone wildly swinging a ball-peen hammer against the aluminum belly of the aircraft. Thwack, thwack, thwack. "Taking fire from the 3 o'clock high," Jackson yelled over the intercom. The deafening, rhythmic hammering of his M240H machine gun immediately flooded the cabin as he returned fire, feeding belts of 7.62mm brass out the right door. Hot shell casings rained down on the cabin floor. Hannah ignored the impacts. Her focus narrowed entirely to a small clearing of flat dirt near the dried riverbed, marked by the purple plume of a smoke grenade deployed by the pinned-down Pathfinders. The wind was whipping the smoke into a chaotic frenzy. "Flaring," Hannah announced. She pulled back on the cyclic, bleeding off their forward airspeed while dropping the collective to manage the descent rate. The nose of the Black Hawk pitched up, the massive 60-foot rotor disc biting hard into the turbulent air. As the wheels descended toward the earth, the immense downwash of the rotors slammed into the loose dirt of the valley floor. In a fraction of a second, a blinding wall of brown dust engulfed the aircraft. It was a classic brownout. The horizon vanished. The rocks vanished. The smoke vanished. Hannah was suddenly flying entirely blind inside a swirling, impenetrable cloud of dirt, relying on muscle memory and the precise verbal cues of her crew chiefs. 10 feet. Drift right. Keep it coming down," Ruiz called out from the left door, leaning out into the dust storm while tethered to his monkey harness. 5 feet. Hold your drift. 3, 2, 1, contact. The heavy landing gear absorbed the impact as the Black Hawk settled onto the uneven bedrock. "We're down," Hannah said, holding the controls with an iron grip, keeping the rotors fully engaged. "Load 'em up, load 'em up." Through the blowing dust, shadows began to materialize. The Pathfinder team emerged from the rocks, moving with desperate, frantic speed. Hannah couldn't see their faces, only the silhouettes of men weighed down by armor and combat webbing, dragging two limp figures between them. "I got 4 coming in the right side," Jackson shouted over the roar of the engines and his own suppressive fire. "They've got wounded, 2 more trailing." The cabin suddenly shifted on its shocks as the first soldiers threw themselves onto the floor plates, dragging their bleeding comrades inside. The smell of copper blood, burned cordite, and sweat instantly permeated the cockpit. Then, the battlefield dynamics violently shifted. A heavy DSHK machine gun, entirely hidden in a secondary ambush position on the lower ridge, opened up. The larger, armor-piercing rounds tore through the air with supersonic cracks, ripping straight into the Black Hawk's tail section. The impact was severe enough to throw Hannah hard against her shoulder harness. Simultaneously, the master caution panel on the center console lit up in a terrifying blaze of amber and red warnings. The high-pitched wail of the caution alarm pierced her headset. "We're hit! Tail boom took a heavy burst!" Miller shouted, his hands hovering over the emergency panels. "Number 1 hydraulic pressure is dropping. Fast!" A sharp, acrid smell of burning hydraulic fluid and electrical smoke began to seep into the cockpit through the environmental control system. Hannah's eyes darted across the gauges. The hydraulic bleed meant she was seconds away from losing the flight control servos. If they lost hydraulics on the ground, the aircraft would become a 12,000-pound static target, a metal coffin for everyone inside. "2 men still outside," Ruiz screamed from the back. "They're pinned behind a boulder, 50 meters out. They can't cross the open ground." Hannah strained to see through the dust and the rain of incoming fire. 2 solitary figures were huddled behind a jagged slab of slate, pinned down by a relentless stream of tracers chewing the ground to pieces around them. A large, dirt-covered man with a radio handset slung over his chest slammed his hand onto the bulkhead behind Hannah's seat. It was the Pathfinder team leader, Staff Sergeant Hayes. His face was smeared with blood and dirt, his eyes wide with the terrifying calculus of the moment. He plugged his helmet into the aircraft's internal communication system. "Chief, we are being overrun," Hayes yelled over the comms, his voice cracking with exertion and panic. "They have heavy weapons dialing in on this LZ. We are going to lose this bird." "We have 2 of your men out there," Hannah fired back, her hand refusing to pull the collective. Her doctrine, her pride, her very soul as a pilot, demanded she wait. "You do not leave men behind." "They are cut off," Hayes screamed, looking back at the wounded men bleeding out on the floor of the cabin, then looking at the flashing red warnings on Hannah's dashboard. "You have 10 men in the back of this aircraft, and 2 of them are dying right now. If you stay, we all burn. Lift off. God damn it, lift off." The number 1 hydraulic pressure needle dipped dangerously close to the red line. The primary flight controls felt sluggish, a terrifying heaviness translating through the cyclic into Hannah's palm. The math was absolute. The machine was dying. If she waited 10 more seconds, they would not have the mechanical ability to leave. Hannah stared at the 2 isolated shadows behind the rock. She felt a cold, physical knot form in the pit of her stomach, a profound, sickening realization of what she had to do. "Jackson Ruiz, suppressive fire, pour it on," Hannah ordered, her voice stripped of all emotion, reduced to absolute, clinical survival. She pulled the collective up into her armpit and pushed the cyclic forward. The wounded Black Hawk screamed in protest, the engine surging to maximum power as the rotors beat violently against the canyon air. The aircraft tore itself free from the dirt, staggering into the sky with a heavy, unnatural sway. As they lifted through the dust cloud and banked hard to escape the kill zone, Hannah caught one final, agonizing glimpse in her chin bubble window. The 2 soldiers were returning fire, alone, shrinking into the distance as the helicopter climbed away, leaving them behind in the rocks. The Black Hawk clawed for altitude, fighting both the violent downdrafts of the storm and its own catastrophic mechanical wounds. The aircraft felt heavy, sluggish, and incredibly fragile. With the number 1 hydraulic system bleeding out, The automatic flight control computers were struggling to keep the helicopter stable, forcing Hannah to physically wrestle the cyclic and pedals to maintain their heading. Every correction required a hard, deliberate exertion of muscle. Inside the cockpit, the master caution panel continued its angry, amber glow. The high-pitched warning tones had been silenced, leaving only the deafening rhythmic beat of the main rotor and the heavy breathing of the crew over the intercom. In the back, the reality of what had just happened settled over the cabin like a lead blanket. The sharp, frantic energy of the extraction had evaporated, replaced by the grim sounds of combat medicine. Through her peripheral vision, Hannah could see Jackson and Ruiz off their guns, kneeling on the blood-slicked floorboards, helping the Pathfinder medic apply tourniquets and pressure dressings to the wounded. "Havoc Base, this is Dustoff 2-6, Hannah transmitted, her voice maintaining the forced, sterile calm required of an aircraft commander. "We are clear of the wash, heading south. We have 10 personnel on board, multiple urgent surgicals. Our aircraft has sustained heavy battle damage. We have lost primary hydraulics, requesting emergency landing priority at the forward surgical team pad." "Copy 2-6. The pad is cleared for you. Medical teams are standing by." The radio operator at Havoc paused, the silence heavy. 2-6. Be advised. We are picking up distress traffic on the tactical net from the valley floor. Hannah felt a cold spike of dread push through her chest. She reached down to the center console and rotated the frequency dial to the ground team's internal channel. The audio fed directly into her helmet, cutting through the roar of the engines. It was not screaming. It was worse. It was the terrifying, breathless, calculated communication of men who knew exactly how little time they had left. "Viper 2 Alpha, this is 2 Bravo. They are moving down the scree field on our left flank. I have 1 mag left." "Copy, Bravo. Hold your sector. Make them earn the dirt." The distinct, rapid popping of incoming PKM machine gun fire echoed through the transmission, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of an American M4 rifle firing single, measured shots. Staff Sergeant Hayes, the Pathfinder commander sitting in the jump seat behind Hannah, keyed his internal mic. His voice was defensive, raw with the guilt of a leader who had just lost a portion of his team. "Turn that channel down, Chief," Hayes ordered. "There's nothing we can do for them now. We had to make the call. If we stayed in that LZ for 5 more seconds, we would have taken an RPG to the engine block. You saved 10 men today. You did your job." Hannah didn't answer. She kept her eyes fixed on the gray, rain-streaked windshield. The mountain peaks were blurring together in the worsening weather. Her hands gripped the controls so tightly her knuckles ached through her Nomex gloves. She had spent 10 years building a reputation as the pilot who did everything right. The pilot who followed the checklist. The pilot who never let ego override the flight manual. According to every piece of Army aviation doctrine written, she was currently executing the correct maneuver. The aircraft was failing. She had critically wounded men on board, and returning to a hot landing zone was a court-martial offense, a mathematical impossibility, and a death sentence. 2 Alpha, I'm hit," the radio crackled. The voice was younger, strained tight with sudden agony. "Took one in the plate. Ricochet caught my shoulder. I can't shoulder the weapon." "Keep your head down, Bravo. I've got the angle." Hannah looked over at Miller. The young co-pilot was staring at his instruments, his face completely devoid of color. He was terrified, but he was holding his station, trusting her completely. She looked at the fuel gauges. They had enough to make it back, but not enough to loiter. She looked at the backup hydraulic pump indicator. It was holding pressure, but the temperature was creeping up. The machine was slowly bleeding to death. "Chief," Hayes said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper over the intercom. "I am the senior ground commander. I am telling you, we made the only tactical choice available. You cannot let this eat you up. We are going home." Hannah felt the vibration of the collective in her left hand. She thought about the 2 men bleeding in the rocks, listening to the sound of her rotor blades fading away into the storm. She thought about what it meant to wear the uniform, and what it meant to be the person sitting in the right seat of an aircraft with the word "Dustoff" painted on the side. Being reliable didn't just mean following the rules. It meant being the person who refused to let the worst-case scenario dictate the terms of someone else's survival. Hannah reached up and switched her radio transmitter off the Havoc base channel, isolating her comms to the crew network. "Miller," Hannah said quietly. "Yes, Chief?" Miller responded, his voice trembling slightly. "Take a deep breath. Cross-check your harness. Secure your sidearm." Miller looked up from the displays, his eyes widening behind his visor. "Chief?" Hannah ignored him and keyed her mic again, her voice projecting with absolute, undeniable authority. "Jackson, Ruiz. Secure the wounded to the floor rings, lock yourselves into your harnesses, and cycle your weapons. We are going back to work." "What the hell are you doing?" Hayes shouted, leaning forward against his restraints. "I gave you a direct order to RTB. This bird is falling apart. You're going to kill all of us." "Sergeant Hayes," Hannah replied, her tone as cold and hard as the mountains around them. "You are a passenger on my aircraft. Sit back and hold on." Without waiting for another word of protest, Hannah depressed the force trim release button on the cyclic. She aggressively kicked in the left pedal and pushed the stick hard to the left and forward. The heavily damaged Black Hawk violently banked into a terrifying 60-degree diving turn. The sudden G-force pinned everyone in the cabin to their seats as the helicopter fell out of the clouds, turning its nose back toward the dark, jagged maw of the Korengal Wash. The master caution panel flashed brightly against the gray storm, but Hannah ignored it, fixing her eyes on the ravine below. The retreat was over. The Black Hawk plummeted back into the Korengal Wash like a wounded bird of prey. This time, there was no element of surprise. The enemy forces on the ridgeline had consolidated their positions, swarming the scree field in a coordinated push to eliminate the final two pathfinders. As Hannah broke through the low-hanging cloud deck, the valley floor was already lit up by the frantic, intersecting geometry of green tracer fire. The controls in Hannah's hands felt as though they had been submerged in wet concrete. The number 1 hydraulic system was entirely gone, and the backup pump was screaming in protest, struggling to push fluid to the primary flight control servos. Every movement of the cyclic required Hannah to throw her entire upper body weight into the maneuver, fighting the massive, raw torque of the rotor blades. "Target spotted! 11 o'clock low!" Miller shouted, his voice cracking with adrenaline. He pointed through the rain-streaked acrylic. Hannah saw them. 2 solitary figures huddled beneath a jagged outcrop of dark rock. The ground around them was boiling with dust and shrapnel as heavy machine gun fire chewed the earth to pieces. The enemy fighters were less than 50 yards away and closing fast. "Jackson, Ruiz, weapons free. Give me a wall of lead," Hannah ordered, her jaw clamped tight. "Get some," Jackson roared. The deafening, rhythmic hammering of both M240H door guns erupted simultaneously. A solid sheet of 7.62 millimeters suppressing fire poured from the helicopter, shredding the brush and rock on the higher elevation. The inside of the cabin instantly filled with the sharp, sulfuric stench of burned cordite and the chaotic clatter of hundreds of empty brass casings rolling across the metal floor. Hannah didn't look for a landing zone. There wasn't one, and she didn't have the time to clear a space. She pushed the nose down, accelerating into a terrifying, aggressive dive straight toward the trapped men. "Coming in hot," Hannah announced, her voice eerily calm against the backdrop of total chaos. "I am going to use the aircraft as a shield. I cannot put it all the way down. You will have to drag them in." She flared the aircraft violently, 50 feet off the deck. The sudden deceleration caused the damaged airframe to shudder so violently that the instrument panel blurred in front of her eyes. Hannah swung the tail of the Black Hawk around, intentionally placing the heavily armored belly and the right flank of the helicopter directly between the advancing enemy fighters and the 2 men on the ground. "Right wheel on the rock," Hannah shouted over the intercom, fighting a sudden, brutal downdraft that threatened to slam them into the dirt. She eased the collective down, hovering inches above the uneven terrain. The right main landing gear slammed hard onto the surface of a massive, rain-slicked boulder. The left wheel hung completely suspended in the air over a steep drop-off. The 60-foot rotor disc was spinning less than 10 feet from the sheer rock wall of the ravine. If a sudden gust of wind pushed them even a fraction to the right, the blades would strike the granite, and the aircraft would instantly tear itself apart. "Hold it right here!" Ruiz screamed, unclipping his primary safety tether and leaning precariously out of the open left door, directly into the blistering rotor wash. "Move! Move! Get to the bird!" Below them, the two isolated soldiers realized what was happening. One of them, grasping his blood-soaked shoulder, staggered to his feet. The other soldier grabbed his teammate by the webbing of his plate carrier and dragged him out from behind the rock, fighting through the blinding hurricane-force wind generated by the helicopter. Rounds began to impact the Black Hawk again. The sound was terrifying, a deafening metallic tearing noise that echoed through the cabin. The windshield directly in front of Miller instantly spiderwebbed as a round deflected off the armored glass. Miller flinched, instinctively throwing his hands up, but he didn't pull away from his station. "We are taking heavy hits to the fuselage," Jackson yelled, firing his machine gun in continuous, unbroken bursts until the barrel glowed white-hot in the dim light of the storm. Hannah ignored the sounds of the dying aircraft around her. Her entire existence narrowed down to a 6-inch square of space. She stared fixedly at a crack in the boulder touching her right wheel, using it as a visual reference point. She modulated the cyclic and pedals with agonizing micromillimeter precision, physically wrestling the helicopter to keep it balanced on the rock. Her arms burned with lactic acid. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes beneath her visor. The master caution panel was lit up like a Christmas tree, signaling a cascading failure of the electrical and transmission systems. Come on," Ruiz grunted. He reached down as the two men reached the skid. Ruiz grabbed the handle of the wounded soldier's combat harness and, with a massive heave, hauled him up over the edge and onto the blood-slicked floorboards. The second soldier didn't wait. He threw his rifle into the cabin and vaulted inside, crashing heavily against Ruiz. "We got him! They're in! Go, go, go!" Ruiz screamed, instantly pivoting back to grab his machine gun. Hannah didn't wait for confirmation. She pulled the collective hard into her armpit and slammed the cyclic forward. At that exact second, the backup hydraulic pump failed. The warning alarm shrieked in Hannah's ear, and the flight controls instantly locked up, suddenly requiring hundreds of pounds of force to move. The Black Hawk dipped dangerously to the left, the main rotor blades sweeping mere inches from the ground. Hannah gritted her teeth, planted her boots firmly on the pedals, and used every ounce of strength in her upper body to force the heavy cyclic forward. The battered machine groaned, an awful, mechanical sound of structural agony. But it obeyed. The Black Hawk tore itself away from the boulder, dragging its belly through the brush before finally finding enough forward airspeed to gain translational lift. They vaulted away from the valley floor, leaving the kill zone behind. The cabin was a chaotic mess of screaming engines, rushing wind, and wounded men. But as they broke through the cloud layer and into the gray sky, they were airborne. All 14 of them. The flight back to Havoc Base was an exercise in pure physical endurance. Without hydraulic assistance, every minor adjustment to the flight controls required brutal, sustained force. Hannah and Miller operated in near total silence, their shoulders aching, their flight suits soaked through with cold sweat. The Black Hawk did not fly so much as it stubbornly refused to fall, groaning and vibrating with every rotation of its damaged turbine engines. When the landing zone at the forward surgical team pad finally materialized through the rain, there was no relief, only a hardened focus to finish the job. Hannah brought the aircraft in fast and shallow. She didn't have the mechanical authority to execute a smooth flare. The Black Hawk hit the concrete pad hard, the heavy landing gear compressing violently before bouncing once and settling with a sickening metallic crunch. "Cut the throttles," Hannah ordered, her voice completely hoarse. "Kill the engines, kill everything." Miller reached up and slammed the power control levers to the off position. The deafening roar of the turbines finally died, spooling down into a high-pitched whine. Outside, the tarmac was already chaotic. A crash rescue team, trailed by half a dozen medical personnel with stretchers, rushed through the rotor wash. Hannah kept her hands firmly gripped on the cyclic until the main rotor blades finally ground to a halt. Only then did she let go. Her arms were trembling so violently she could barely unclip her helmet harness. In the back, the medics were shouting over each other, offloading the wounded Pathfinders. Jackson and Ruiz stood by the doors, their uniforms stained with hydraulic fluid and blood, watching the medical teams rush the soldiers toward the surgical tent. Hannah slowly unplugged her comms wire and pushed her door open. The cold mountain air hit her face, cutting through the smell of burned wire and aviation fuel. She stepped down onto the wet concrete, her legs feeling like lead. She looked at the side of her aircraft. The tail boom was riddled with jagged holes from the DSHK rounds. The fuselage was scored by shrapnel, and dark streaks of hydraulic fluid painted the armored belly. The multi-million-dollar machine was effectively destroyed. A heavy set of boots marched onto the pad. It was Major Vance, the Aviation Battalion's executive officer, flanked by 2 military police officers. His face was a mask of furious, tightly controlled disbelief. "Warrant Officer Brooks," Vance barked, stopping a few feet from her. "You deliberately ignored a direct order from a ground commander. You diverted a critically damaged airframe, risked a crew, and nearly lost an asset over a hot zone you were cleared to leave. You are grounded, effectively immediately. Hand over your sidearm and your flight log." Hannah stood up straight. She felt no anger, just a profound, hollow exhaustion. She knew the regulations better than anyone. She had broken them all. She reached for the holster strapped to her thigh, fully prepared to accept the end of her career. "Major," the voice cut through the rain, rough and exhausted. Staff Sergeant Hayes stepped out from the shadow of the surgical tent. He was limping, one arm securely wrapped in a fresh bandage, his face pale but his eyes burning with an intense, unyielding clarity. He walked slowly past the military police and positioned himself directly between Hannah and the Major. "Sergeant, you need to be in medical," Vance said, his tone softening slightly, recognizing the Pathfinder's condition. "I need to clear the record, sir," Hayes replied, standing as close to attention as his battered body would allow. "Warrant Officer Brooks did not ignore a ground commander. She corrected a fractured extraction. I made a premature call under duress. I panicked, and I ordered her out while my team was still split. She realized my tactical error, and she possessed the airmanship to fix it. If she hadn't turned that bird around, you would be writing 2 letters to Gold Star families tonight. Instead, every single one of my men is alive." Vance frowned, glancing from Hayes to the completely mangled helicopter, and then to Hannah. "Sergeant, the radio logs indicate you explicitly ordered her to RTB." "The radio logs don't reflect the truth on the ground, Major," Hayes said, his voice dropping to a low, definitive timbre. "She didn't risk this crew. She commanded them, and she did what the rest of us didn't have the spine to do." The tarmac went silent, save for the steady patter of rain against the concrete. Vance looked at Hannah. He had known her for 3 years as the quiet, strictly by-the-book pilot who never took a chance. He looked at the aircraft she had somehow brought home, realizing the absolute physical and emotional impossibility of what she had just accomplished. "Get your arm looked at, Sergeant," Vance finally said. He turned back to Hannah. He didn't ask for her weapon. "Chief Brooks, you will report to the command post for a full formal debrief in 2 hours. Bring your crew." Vance turned and walked away, dismissing the military police with a wave of his hand. Hannah exhaled, a shaky breath she felt she had been holding since they first dropped into the wash. She looked at Hayes. The Pathfinder didn't say another word. He didn't need to. He simply offered a slow, deliberate nod of absolute respect, a silent acknowledgement forged in the worst place on earth. He turned and limped back toward his men. An hour later, the tarmac was empty. The rain had slowed to a mist. Hannah stood alone inside the dimly lit maintenance hangar, looking out at the silhouette of her broken Black Hawk on the pad. Mechanics would soon swarm it, evaluating if it could ever fly again. She rubbed her aching shoulder, feeling the heavy, damp fabric of her flight suit. For years, she had believed that being a professional meant strictly following the math, minimizing risk, and bringing the machine home intact. But as she listened to the distant hum of the base, she realized the truth of the uniform she wore. Sometimes the math is wrong. Sometimes the only way to be truly reliable is to embrace the terrifying weight of the worst-case scenario and risk everything to ensure no one is left alone in the dark. Hannah Brooks turned off the hangar lights and walked out into the rain, knowing she would fly again and knowing she would never be the same pilot she was before the Korengal wash. Thank you for listening to Hannah's story today. If this narrative of courage and the true weight of leadership resonated with you, please take a moment to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support is what allows us to keep bringing these powerful, realistic military stories to life. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe and thank you for watching.